Okay, let's unpack this. The Bible mentions giants, right? Figures like Goliath, maybe the Nephilim. These stories, they've always grabbed people's attention. But our sources today, they make it really clear there's way more going on here than just, tall people.
Yeah, definitely more.
We've got a stack of articles, some research here, all focused specifically on these biblical mentions of giants.
Mm.
It's going to be a real deep dive into the language, the ancient world context, and honestly, some interpretations that really surprised me.
And our goal here really is to untangle those different Hebrew terms the Bible uses. Because it's not just one word. We want to explore the fascinatingly varied ideas about who these figures actually were, where they might have come from, examine the role they play in the bigger story, the biblical narrative, and try to understand the ancient world they actually lived in.
Right.
It's about getting beyond just a surface reading,
Yeah.
to get a much more nuanced picture of what the text is telling us, and also how people have wrestled with it over, centuries.
So stick with us. We're going to look at some linguistic details, jump into the key Bible passages, see how the views have shifted historically, and wrestle with some apparent textual puzzles that scholars are still debating. It should be interesting.
Definitely.
So maybe the first thing, something our sources really hammered home for me was this. When my English Bible says giants, it's like, well, it's not always the same Hebrew word behind it.
Exactly. That's really crucial to get up front. It's not a simple one-to-one thing. There's several distinct Hebrew terms involved, and recognizing that is kind of the first step to seeing the complexity here.
Okay.
The main ones you're likely to run into are Nephilim, Rephaim, and Anakim. And understanding these specific terms is pretty essential because, they show up in different places, different contexts. They carry different shades of meaning,
And this is where it gets really fascinating for me. The impact of translation choices. Like, take Nephilim, that famous word from Genesis 6. Our sources point out that when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, the LXX way back centuries before Christ, they translated Nephilim as gigantes.
Gigantes.
Now, you said the Hebrew root for Nephilim, naphal, mostly means to fall, right? Suggesting maybe fallen ones.
That's the primary meaning, yes, fallen ones.
But gigantes in Greek. Well, that word specifically means those huge, monstrous beings from their own mythology, born from, the earth and sky gods.
Right. So that translation choice immediately put the spotlight on physical size. It linked the biblical Nephilim directly to those, massive, often chaotic figures from Greek mythology. And our sources really show how profoundly that shaped later thinking. It potentially shifted the focus mainly onto size and strength, maybe overshadowing that original sense of them being fallen or somehow out of place in God's created order.
Wow. So just that one choice, translating it as giants, it could have fundamentally changed how people pictured the Nephilim for, centuries. If they hadn't used that Greek word, would we even think of them primarily as just huge?
It certainly seems to have pushed the interpretation very strongly in that direction, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to overstate the influence of the Septuagint.
Okay. Let's jump into that first mention then. Genesis 6.1 to 4, it's maybe the most mysterious one. And you mentioned its placement right before the flood story is super significant.
Absolute key.
It reads something like, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown.
Yeah, the placement is critical. This passage comes immediately before God decides to, cleanse the earth with the flood because of all the wickedness and corruption. The way the story is structured, it implies a direct link between these Nephilim, how they came about, and God's grief and judgment. It's like a setup, illustrating just how deep the moral, maybe even cosmic decay had become. It shows why such a drastic response was, in the narrative's logic, necessary.
Okay, yeah, that verse is famous. But it's also just kind of strange, isn't it? Sons of God and daughters of men. Who are these groups? What does this union even mean? Our sources make it clear scholars have wrestled with this forever, and there are definitely different takes.
Oh, absolutely. The identity of the sons of God is maybe the biggest point of debate in this passage.
Yeah.
Our sources lay out a few main interpretations, and what's really interesting is the fallen angel view. This is generally seen as the oldest interpretation. You find it in early Jewish texts, even some outside the Bible. It suggests the sons of God were actually fallen angels, sometimes called watchers in books like Enoch. They supposedly came down, cohabited with human women, and the Nephilim were their kids, these hybrid offspring, often pictured as monstrous or, gigantic. The evidence cited often points to other places in the Old Testament, like Job or some Psalms, where sons of God seems to mean angels. And this whole idea gets really fleshed out in non-biblical books like 1 Enoch and the Book of Giants, which date back centuries BCE. They go into detail about these angels and their giant destructive kids.
Wow.
And our sources note that this view, while ancient, has actually seen a bit of a comeback in modern times.
So the oldest idea is literally angels having kids with humans. That sounds almost, well, like those Greek myths again, the demigods. What does that view say about why they were giants then? Is it just...
In that framework, their huge size, or monstrous nature, is often seen as a direct result of that unnatural origin, a kind of perversion of the created order from mixing spiritual beings and humans.
Okay. What else?
Then you get the Sethian view. This one gained a lot of ground later on. It became pretty dominant among many early church fathers, think Augustine, and then later with the reformers like Luther and Calvin.
Right.
This view argues that the sons of God weren't angels, but the godly descendants of Adam and Eve through their third son, Seth. They supposedly intermarried with the ungodly daughters of men who were from the line of Cain.
Okay, that feels maybe less mythological. It keeps it all human, at least.
Exactly. And that was part of its appeal, for sure. It avoided some tricky theological questions about whether angels could even procreate. People would point to verses like Mark 12.25, where Jesus says angels don't marry in heaven. So in the Sethian view, the Nephilim are the wicked, or you could say fallen, children resulting from this spiritual compromise. The godly line mixing with the ungodly line, leading to the terrible corruption described right before the flood.
Gotcha. Is there another main one?
There's a third view, maybe less common but still discussed, the despot king view. This interprets sons of God as powerful human rulers, maybe tyrants, kings who took many wives, perhaps forcibly. And the Nephilim, then, were their offspring exceptionally strong, famous warriors, men of renown. This view sometimes ties into ancient Near Eastern ideas where kings were occasionally described using language that kind of bordered on the divine or semi-divine.
Huh. It's amazing how one phrase sparks such different readings. Now, what about the word Nephilim itself? We know it often gets translated giants, but you said the root nephal means to fall, so fallen ones. But Genesis 6.4 also calls them heroes and warriors of renown. That feels a bit contradictory. Are they fallen and bad or heroes and famous?
It does create a tension, yeah. The term itself might imply they fell from some higher status, or maybe just that they fell upon others violently, like attackers. Being called heroes and warriors of renown highlights the impact they had, their reputation in the ancient world, whatever their origin or morality.
Okay. And the size thing, Genesis 6 doesn't actually say they were huge, does it?
Not explicitly right there in Genesis 6, no. But the connection to enormous size becomes really undeniable later on, specifically in Numbers 13.33. That passage directly links a post-flood group, the Anakim, to the Nephilim. And that's where the Israelite spies famously say the Anakim made them feel like grasshoppers. That strongly implies immense size for the Anakim and, by association, for the Nephilim they're linked to.
Right, the grasshopper report. We'll get back to that.
But just sticking with Genesis 6 for a second, the main point, no matter how you interpret sons of God, is the role the Nephilim play there. They're presented as a major factor, maybe even a reason for the flood. Their existence, the whole situation around their birth. It illustrates this profound state of decay, this challenge to divine order, that ultimately triggers God's judgment in the story.
Okay, so they're tied directly to why the flood happened. But here's that puzzle we talked about, and it feels like a big one. Genesis 6.4 says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. If the flood was total, meant to wipe out everything, especially the wickedness tied to the Nephilim, how could they possibly be there afterward? Did some swim?
Probably not, but yeah, that afterward is a famous sticking point. And it leads us right into the post-flood era, where the Israelites, getting ready to enter Canaan, run into other groups, also described as, well, giants or very tall people. The Anakim are a prime example. They were supposedly descendants of a guy named Anak, a powerful people in southern Canaan near Hebron. And you mentioned the spies report in Numbers 13. That's the grasshopper moment. But critically, the spies explicitly say, we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim.
Ah, so they directly call the Anakim Nephilim after the flood.
Exactly. Now, Joshua later drives most of them out during the conquest of Canaan, but the text says some remnants survived in Philistine cities, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod.
Okay, so that's where the size connection gets super explicit, with the spies just terrified. And they use the word Nephilim again, post-flood. That really does seem to clash with the idea of the flood wiping everything related to them out.
It certainly creates a narrative tension, yeah. We'll dig into how people try to resolve that. But first, let's mention another group, the Rephaim.
Okay, riffle.
This was apparently an ancient race, found over in Transjordan, east of the Jordan River, and also in Canaan. The word Rephaim itself is tricky, etymologically. Depending on context, it might connect to ideas like faded ones, maybe healed ones, or even ghosts or shades of the dead.
Ghosts. That's different.
Yeah, and interestingly, other ancient Near Eastern texts, like from Ugarit up in Syria, mention figures called Huppup. These often seem to be linked to like deified ancestral spirits or maybe figures from the underworld. So it suggests this term might tap into a broader regional concept.
Okay.
And tied closely to the Rephaim are two other groups, the Imiam and the Zebzumimim. Deuteronomy chapter 2 explicitly describes them. It says they were strong, numerous, and as tall as the Anakites. So huge again.
Like the Anakim.
Right. And the text says these groups, the Imiam and Zebzumim, were dispossessed by the Moabites and the Ammonites. Often it implies with God's help, which allowed those nations, Moab and Ammon, to settle in the land these giants used to occupy.
So you start seeing this pattern across different books. These various groups, Anakim, Rephaim, Imim, Zamzumim, they seem concentrated in specific areas, Hebron, Bashan, the lands of Moab and Ammon. And they're consistently described as huge, strong, and frankly, terrifying to the Israelites.
Exactly, which brings us back to that puzzle, that afterword in Genesis 6.4, plus the Anakim being called Nephilim in Numbers 13.33. As you said, it's a real theological and narrative challenge, especially if you read Genesis 6 and the flood story as a literal total wipeout of that specific Nephilim line. If the flood was God's judgment targeting that problem, how do they reappear?
Yeah, how do scholars deal with that?
Well, our sources outline a few different approaches people take. Some scholars question whether we should read the flood story as wiping out absolutely every single trace of the Nephilim lineage or influence. Maybe the afterword implies something survived somehow. Others propose what you might call a second incursion theory, like maybe fallen angels did it again after the flood, started a new Nephilim line. Others suggest maybe the post-flood gigantism wasn't directly related genetically to the pre-flood Nephilim at all. Maybe it was new mutations or just unusual large people groups. And in that case, the spies in Numbers might have just been using the term Nephilim loosely, or maybe hyperbolically, just to say these guys are terrifyingly huge without meaning a literal bloodline connection.
Or, I guess, could the spies just have been exaggerating or even lying to scare everyone off from going into Canaan? That was part of their report, wasn't it? The bad report.
Yes, that's definitely another perspective scholars consider for number 13, that the spies' claim about seeing Nephilim might have been exaggeration or even a deliberate falsehood designed to frighten the Israelites and justify their own fear and lack of faith.
It's wild how one little phrase, and also afterward, and one link in Numbers creates such a huge discussion. It really does force you to look deeper at how all these texts fit together, or maybe where the tensions are.
Precisely. It prevents a simplistic reading.
Okay, so moving on from the groups, the Bible also talks about some specific, really famous individuals who were giants. Right?
Absolutely. Some key figures.
Like King Og of Bashan, I remember reading about him. Deuteronomy 3.11 calls him the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. And the text makes a point about his bed, doesn't it? His iron bedstead was huge, like, what was it, 13, 14 feet long?
Yeah, estimates based on the cubit measurement put it somewhere around 13.5 to maybe 15.7 feet long and 6 or 7 feet wide. It's enormous.
Wow.
And his defeat by Moses and the Israelites before they even crossed the Jordan is presented as this massive, almost unbelievable victory. It's clearly meant to show God's power overcoming a seemingly unbeatable enemy.
A literal giant obstacle.
Exactly. And then, of course, the most famous one of all.
Has to be Goliath.
Almost certainly Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion, 1 Samuel 17. His height? Well, it actually varies a bit, depending on which ancient manuscript you look at. Some traditions, like based on the Masoretic text, put him around 9'9". Others, like based on some Septuagint manuscripts and a Dead Sea Scroll fragment, have him closer to 6'9".
Oh, interesting. So even his height is debated. Still, even 6'9" back then with all that armor.
Oh, absolutely. Even the shorter height makes him a massive warrior for that era, and the description paints a fearsome picture. Heavy bronze armor, the spear shaft like a weaver's beam, that huge iron spearhead weighing maybe 15 pounds. He was built for war.
And then the story of David, this young shepherd, taking him down with just a sling and a stone. It's probably the classic story of, divine help and faith beating impossible odds. Seeing the physical description just makes David's win even more stunning.
It really does. It magnifies the theological message. And it's worth noting, Goliath wasn't some lone freak. The Bible mentions other Philistine giants from his hometown, Gath. They're described as descendants of Rapha, which is likely connected to the Rephaim.
Oh, really? More giants from Gath?
Yeah, figures like Saph, Lami, who Horns Chronicle says was Goliath's brother Ishbibanob, and another unnamed warrior. And that unnamed guy has this really specific, intriguing detail mentioned in 2 Samuel 21.
What's that?
It says he had polydactyly, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
Whoa, 6 fingers and 6 toes. That's specific. Kind of creepy.
It's a striking detail.
So these individuals, Og and the Gath giants, they represent this ongoing challenge, right? This lineage of huge adversaries popping up to face Israel and, by extension, Israel's God.
Looking at the big picture now, our sources consistently emphasize that these giants, whether the ancient groups like the Anakim or Rephaim, or these later individuals like Og and Goliath, they serve a consistent role in the biblical story. They function as these formidable opponents. They inspire fear. They represent major tests of faith for the Israelites. But here's the crucial point, and it's stressed again and again in the sources. Their defeat is always attributed primarily to God's power and intervention. It's not just about human strength or strategy, even though those are present. Think of Moses defeating Og, David defeating Goliath.
Yeah.
The narrative frames these as Yahweh's victories.
Yeah, that ties right into that bigger biblical theme, doesn't it? It really highlights God's sovereignty. Like, no obstacle, no matter how physically huge or scary it looks, is too big for God or for his people when they trust him.
Exactly.
So these aren't just like cool monster stories from the ancient world. They're fundamentally about God showing his power.
Precisely. They repurpose maybe common ancient tropes about giants and heroes into lessons about faith and divine power. And it's important to remember the ancient Near Eastern context here, too. The idea of giants or super powerful ancient beings wasn't unique to Israel at all. You had the Gigantes in Greek myths, you had figures like the Abkalu sages, or the hero Gilgamesh in Mesopotamian stories. In fact, that non-canonical book of giants we mentioned earlier, it actually lists Gilgamesh as one of the giants descended from the Watchers.
Wow, okay. So the idea was floating around.
Yeah, as part of the cultural air they breathed. However, our sources argue that the biblical writers used these motifs for a very specific, unique purpose. While they were likely aware of these other traditions, they embed their giants within what they present as a real history, a real genealogy, not just pure myth like pagan demigods.
Right.
And the stories about Israelite heroes defeating these giants, they're told specifically to demonstrate Yahweh's power triumphing over forces hostile to his people and his created order. It asserts God's control over all forces, and it kind of reframes or pushes back against other heroic narratives from the region that might challenge Yahweh's unique sovereignty.
That makes sense. And it's also interesting how the interpretations within Judaism and Christianity have shifted over time. You mentioned that early angel theory about the Nephilim from texts like Enoch and the Book of Giants. That was big early on, but then it kind of faded.
It did, yeah. For centuries, the view that became dominant, especially in the church, was the Sethian view, seeing it as a human drama, the godly line of Seth mixing with the ungodly line of Cain. That was championed by really influential figures like Augustine and later Luther, Calvin. It became the standard reading for a long time. But, as our sources point out, that older angelic interpretation has seen a real resurgence, both in popular interest and in academic scholarship. Partly fueled, actually, by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which included copies of Enoch and the Book of Giants, confirming their antiquity and importance in Second Temple Judaism.
Right.
So this ongoing discussion really underscores, I think, the enduring complexity of these passages. It shows the continuous effort needed to understand them in their original context and also grapple with what they mean theologically, even today.
So, pulling this all together, it's clear that biblical giants is a much richer, way more complicated topic than just, stories about tall guys. We've got multiple Hebrew words, Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim popping up in different places before and after the flood, and sparking these incredibly different interpretations about where they came from. Fallen angels, human lineages, powerful kings. And we can't just brush past those textual challenges like the afterword in Genesis 6 or the Anakim being called Nephilim in Numbers 13. Our sources show these aren't just minor details. They're points of serious scholarly debate that really force us to engage with the text more deeply, more analytically. You can't just do a surface read.
Yeah. But ultimately, despite all the debate about origins and details, that theological takeaway seems really powerful and consistent across the board. These figures, these giants, they serve to magnify God's power. They underscore the absolute importance and the effectiveness of faith when you're facing things that look completely insurmountable.
Exactly.
They really do turn what could just be ancient tales of physical strength into profound lessons about spiritual reality.
Right. So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given how many different ways people have interpreted these figures, how much debate there's been over centuries, how does understanding that complex history maybe change how you think about the role of mystery and debate and ongoing questioning when we try to understand ancient texts like the Bible?